So I want to say a little bit about Philippians as a whole before we dig into Philippians here at the end of the letter that we are reading for today. Philippians is like all Pauline letters. Sorry, Jeopardy. Hebrews is not one. I can't resist. If you didn't see that controversy, ask me about it after church. But Pauline letters take their name from the cities he's writing to. So Paul is writing to the city of Philippi, and he is writing to it from jail. He's talked about this. In fact, Paul has something of an existential crisis going on in his life. And it's that he's not entirely sure whether he wants to die in jail or get out and continue to live and do ministry. And in a fairly famous phrasing, he says, well, to die is gain because I will be with Christ. But so is it to live because I will continue to do ministry in Christ's name. And pervading this letter in which Paul could be in the grips of the depression he seems to be feeling, imprisoned. He's in prison, attacked by some of the people who should have been sharing his ministry. And so in this place that he could have given himself over to that depression, but instead the letter to the church in Philippi abides with a deep sense of gratitude and thanksgiving. In fact, this is the most human and gentle Paul that we get to see. This is the Paul you can see why people gravitated to him. In his letters, we tend to see intellectual, strategic Paul, slightly self-righteous Paul, struggling with what it really means to be humble Paul. But we know, or we can surmise, that Paul had to be a very charismatic person, because he is radically successful in starting Christian communities. And it's from this sense of belovedness that Paul seems to have for his communities that we get this window into his sort of paternal concern for their well-being that can come off like a little condescending parentalism. But in Philippi, we get none of that. With this letter, you get this gracious spirit of Paul that is born in his deep gratitude, because in his crisis of faith, if you will, the generosity of spirit of the community at Philippi is carrying Paul through this time of imprisonment. He's deeply grateful because he is being borne up by their faith and their generous spirits. And that produces in Paul this deep sense of gratitude, but also this wonderful reflection around the Greek word that we were trying to talk a little bit about here with the kids, phronio. And it's a fascinating Greek word because we can't correctly translate it in English. Sometimes it gets translated as I think this, and sometimes it gets translated as I feel this. In fact, later in Philippians, it even gets translated as I am concerned about. But in the Greek, it's this beautiful marrying of thinking and feeling, or what I want to call gut work, right? It's very like in the prophet Hosea's work when God has a thought of judgment, but then God says, but something is being kindled within me, and it's my love for my people, right? You don't have control over what your gut's telling you. Your gut does it as a feeling that is a thought, and a thought that is a feeling. And Paul thinks this is at the heart of Christian discipleship. Because Paul's like, this is what we're attempting to train. our ability to hear the plight of God's people in the way God does. Our ability to have compassion kindle within us when we recognize that despite all of our apparent differences, we share that we are children of God and that we have the same creative spark at work in you is at work in me. And when we're focusing on all that divides us, we can get into a world. In fact, later we're going to hear from Tidwell Services. And at our first service, when they were sharing, they used the word cultural humility. It's a beautiful word, right? When we're focusing on our differences, we can become culturally not humble, right? We think of ourselves as superior, as we think of ourselves as right. But when we start to see that dignity of God's creative spark at work in all of us, in our differences, not in spite of our differences, we start to have a deep and abiding respect for each other. A desire that the same love that kindles in my gut kindles in your gut. And it's from there that Paul can say, when you're in a place of abundance, give to those who are not, because later you're going to be the person who's struggling and needs them to give out of their abundance. So Paul, who has given his heart and his mind, his guts to the church in Philippi, recognizes that now in his place of need, it's the church at Philippi that's carrying him through the darkness of his day. And Paul sees in the heart of his work that he's working on in Philippians, I think through their generosity to him, that this is what Christian discipleship is trying to train, right? It's not making smarter Christians. It's not making people who can have the mind of God because, wait for it, you can't, right? That's beyond us and would be the opposite of humility. Right? But sometimes we think, we Presbyterians think that's what we're after, intellectually aligning ourselves to God. And Paul says, no, it's to get the same burning compassion in your gut for the world that God has for you. And you and you and you. Right? And so it's this phronio Paul wants to continue to train and sees as the training of what it was for 12 desperate people who were rejected by the intellectuals of their day to walk around with Jesus and feel as he felt, see as he saw, until they become trained, as Proverbs 22 might tell us, in the way that we shall go. Right? So that when they encounter later someone as Jesus might have, they have the same instinct. I'm always drawn to that passage in Matthew 25 the church is so enamored of, the sheep and the goats, those who clothed Jesus, fed Jesus. And in all of the cases, the people didn't know they did the things Jesus saw them doing. When did we see you in prison, Jesus, and visit you? When did we do this? And they don't know because it wasn't an intellectual choice. It was a gut instinct that when they saw someone in need, when they felt someone in struggle, they just responded as Jesus would have to the Jesus in them. Right? And this is what Jesus is after, and this then is what Paul is after. Let us train ourselves to react instinctually to the world as God would. And then comes gratitude, right? Not necessarily our first reaction. You see, I'm as cynical and skeptical and jaded as most of you are. I have lots of reactions to what pass interference calls didn't happen in the game last night. I have lots of opinions about the people running for office and their own self-interests in them. I have lots of times when I can start to imagine that it's not worth my energy because we've been there and done that and it didn't work. Jaded skepticism is a natural reaction that we have to the world to protect ourselves from Paul's feeling of futility in the jail. Paul sees and wants to impart to us through the example the church at Philippi set for him that the antidote to that cynicism, the antidote to that lack of compassion for the world, that hardening of heart is gratitude and generosity. That when we start to focus ourselves on the deep well of grace that is alive in us through the work of God, that we can react and train ourselves to react not in skepticism and privilege and self-righteousness and judgment, but in gratitude and generosity. I can see in you the spark I feel in me. And we can not give up on what it means to breathe life into that spark and let it catch flame. We talked at the first light service about the difference between happiness and joy, the connectedness and the difference. And palpable among our conversation was this idea that there is something in joy that is uncontrollable. When joy takes hold of you, you are affected as much by it as you are an expresser of it. Right? That one can feel happy, but one experiences joy, gets caught up in it. It's bubbling up in you like carbonation in a glass of soda, right? And when one is caught up, as Paul seems to be, with the sense of joy, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. You can't help but want to share that joy, which, I might remind you, is not a particularly Presbyterian gift. In our presbiology class, we were talking about why do people call Presbyterians God's frozen chosen? Right? And one of my favorite illustrations of that is a joke that said that, the Presbyterian church was trying to become energy efficient, so they installed motion sensing lights throughout the church building, which became a problem on the first Sunday worship service when the lights in the sanctuary went out halfway through worship. Right? We're not known for moving in the Spirit. We're not known for our effusive and effervescent expressions of joy in our worship. Right? We're the people who didn't have to be told to sit 6 feet apart during COVID because we already do it. It's our gut instinct in the world. And Paul, in Paul's own way, is trying to get us to give that up. As safe and controllable as that feels, it's an amazing thing to come to worship and allow actual worship to break out in our hearts, in our guts, and find ourselves responding to the deep well of generosity and gratitude that I know, because I know you, runs deeply in your veins. But let it show in the world who needs just that spark. When my second year of seminary, we had an alternative context program to go spend a month in the church in another country to kind of hear theology through a different cultural lens. And I spent that in Merida, Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And in the Yucatan Peninsula, one of the other phenomenons I learned is they have a lot of underground rivers. Right? You might look out and see a dry and arid landscape, and yet It's flowering because underground a river is flowing, and that underground river is giving abundant life to the world around it. Paul rejoices in the Lord because the deep and abiding river of faithfulness and gratitude he's feeling the effects of from a community that is hundreds of miles away. And he's feeling that spring up in him and can't help but give it voice and expression. In each and every one of us, there's a deep river of faithfulness, yearning for our expression in gratitude and generosity to help the world see what's lying right beneath the surface, to draw us together. Not in spite of our differences, but in celebration of them, learning from each other, celebrating in each other that spark of divine care that is being kindled in your gut just as it is in mine. And in that fervor, Paul's saying, don't push it down. Don't let it go. Yesterday, my son was playing in the Boise Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, and we went to Nampa to go to the performance. It's conducted by Jen Drake, and if you're involved at all in the music scene of Boise, you know Jen well. She's a phenomenal viola player. I don't know how she chose an instrument that gets a back row, but she did. But she has a effervescent, joyful personality, very bold. She got up in front and she turned to the crowd and she told them that the next piece they were going to play was 4 movements. Now, good symphony goers know you don't clap between movements of a piece. Right? And what Jen said was, you know what I want you to do? If you're going to clap, own it. And if you like what we play, clap. Now, the people behind me said what I was only thinking. Well, so much for training people to be good symphony goers. They said it out loud. I asked them, what Presbyterian church do you go to? Rejoice in the Lord always. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. There is a deep well of faithfulness bearing you forth into the world with gratitude and generosity. Don't staunch it. Don't hide that light under a bushel. Don't let your Pharisee instincts hold sway. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say, rejoice. This is the word of our Lord.